There are engines that made history, and then there are engines that rewrote it. At the very top of that list sits one name, whispered with both awe and fear.
One of my favorites is the 426 HEMI from Chrysler.
The Chrysler 426 Street HEMI. This wasn't just another V8. It wasn't just another number in Detroit's horsepower wars. It was an engineering weapon, a mechanical monster that threatened to crush anything in its path. And yet, strangely, the story of the Street HEMI isn't one of domination. It's one of hesitation, of promises made and broken, of an engine that almost was, but never fully became what it should have been. Picture this. It's the late 1960s. Muscle cars are everywhere. Ford has its Cobra Jet. Pontiac is flexing with its 389 Tri-Power. And the mighty 455 HO. Chevrolet is armed with the LS6. The streets are alive with horsepower. But Chrysler had something none of them could touch. A secret weapon, pulled straight out of racing. A 426 cubic inch masterpiece, born on the high banks of NASCAR. An engine so powerful, so untamed, that people gave it a nickname, the Elephant. Not just because of its size, but because of the way it shook the ground when it roared. When Chrysler decided to adapt that race-bred monster for the street, the automotive world held its breath. The idea of a NASCAR engine sitting under the hood of your Plymouth or Dodge was more than exciting. It was terrifying. This was performance the average driver had never seen before. Performance that made rivals nervous. Performance that could change the entire game. But here's where the mystery begins. If the 426 Street HEMI was so good, if it had the pedigree, the power, and the presence to dominate, then why didn't it? Why is its legacy not one of sheer supremacy, but of limited runs, missed opportunities, and constant whispers of what could have been? The answer, as we'll soon uncover, lies in a storm of corporate fear, government regulations, and a marketplace that simply wasn't ready for a monster of this magnitude. The Street HEMI was too powerful to ignore, but also too dangerous to fully unleash. And that leaves us with a haunting question. What happens when an engine built to conquer the world? We first have to go back to where it all began, on the racetrack. Chrysler wasn't just trying to build another muscle car engine. They were fighting for survival in the world's most brutal proving ground, NASCAR. By the early 1960s, Chrysler was falling behind. Ford and Chevrolet were stealing headlines with their race wins, and Dodge and Plymouth needed something drastic. Chrysler's engineers knew that if they wanted to reclaim glory, they couldn't just tweak what they had. They needed a revolution. And that revolution came in 1964, with the birth of the 426 HEMI. From the moment it fired up, the HEMI was different. Its hemispherical combustion chambers allowed air and fuel to mix more efficiently, giving it explosive power and incredible durability at high RPMs. In racing trim, the HEMI wasn't just fast, it was untouchable. Richard Petty piloted his HEMI-powered Plymouth to a crushing victory at the 1964 Daytona 500, lapping nearly the entire field. Suddenly, Chrysler was back on top. The HEMI had arrived, and Detroit was on notice. But success on the track was only the beginning. Chrysler saw an opportunity. If the HEMI could dominate in NASCAR, why not bring that same engine to the streets? Why not let everyday drivers experience the thrill of a race-bred V8 under their right foot? And so, in 1966, Chrysler unveiled the 426 Street HEMI. It wasn't a watered-down imitation. The Street HEMI shared its DNA with the race engine. Forged internals, huge ports, high-flow heads, dual four-barrel carburetors. It was, in essence, a race engine, barely tamed. Officially, Chrysler rated it at 425 horsepower, but anyone who drove one knew the truth. It made far more than that. On the drag strip, a Street HEMI could humiliate almost anything else Detroit had to offer. On the street, it was raw, violent, and unlike anything the average driver had ever experienced. The cars it powered became instant legends. The Plymouth GTX, the Dodge Charger RT, the Plymouth Roadrunner, the Dodge Coronet. These weren't just cars, they were statements. They told the world Chrysler wasn't just playing in the horsepower, but beneath the glory, shadows were forming. The HEMI was expensive to build, complicated to maintain, and intimidating to insurers and regulators alike. Even as Chrysler celebrated, forces were gathering that would soon turn triumph into tragedy. The Chrysler 426 Street HEMI may not have ruled the streets in its day, but sometimes, legends aren't built on numbers or sales charts. Sometimes, legends are born from mystery, scarcity, and the haunting feeling of what could have been. And that turned the Street HEMI into one of the most mythical engines of all time. Even in limited production, the cars that carried it became instant icons. A HEMI Cuda, a HEMI Charger. These weren't just cars. They were the top of the mountain, the ultimate bragging right. People who owned one back then knew they had something special, even if they didn't know how rare it would become. And those who missed the chance? They were left with a lifelong question. What if? That question has fueled the HEMI's legend for decades. What if Chrysler had fully committed to mass producing it? What if the government hadn't stepped in? What if the HEMI had been free to dominate the streets and tracks? Every enthusiast who studies the muscle car era asks those questions. And that uncertainty is what keeps the Street HEMI alive in our imaginations. Today, the 426 Street HEMI stands as one of the most sought-after engines in collector history. At auctions, HEMI-powered cars fetch eye-watering prices, millions in some cases, not just because of the engine's brute strength, but because of its aura. Because owning one isn't just about horsepower. It's about holding a piece of forbidden history. It's about being able to say, you possess the engine Detroit didn't want you to have. Symbolically, the Street HEMI represents more than just raw muscle. It represents rebellion. It represents the idea that engineers, when given freedom, can create something so far ahead of its time that even the system couldn't contain it. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest creations aren't the ones that lived the longest, but the ones that burned brightest, even for a short while. Ask any car collector, any gearhead, any old-school drag racer. They'll all tell you the same thing. The Street HEMI was different. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't forgiving, it wasn't practical. But it was honest. It was pure. It was raw, unfiltered American horsepower in its most extreme form. It achieved immortality not because it was produced in massive numbers, but because it symbolized the end of an era, the moment when brute force met the full weight of regulation, corporate caution, and changing public perception. The HEMI wasn't just an engine, it was a cultural milestone. When people look back on the golden age of muscle cars, the 426 Street HEMI always commands respect, not for how common it was, but for how untouchable it became. Think about it. Most engines fade into obscurity after their production run. But the HEMI? It turned into a legend whispered among gearheads, painted on the side of drag cars, and etched into racing history. Even those who never drove one still feel the aura. You don't have to see the car. The name alone, HEMI, triggers an emotional reaction. It's power, rebellion, and danger compressed into 4 letters. But here's the tragedy. While it became iconic, its potential was never fully realized. Imagine if Chrysler had been allowed to refine the HEMI, to adapt it through the 70s and 80s, to match modern efficiency with its raw strength. Instead, emissions laws, rising gas prices, and insurance crackdowns strangled it before it could evolve. That's why enthusiasts today feel both awe and regret when they speak of it. It's like remembering a rock star who died too young. You admire the brilliance, but you mourn what could have been. And yet, that's also why the 426 Street HEMI's story resonates so deeply. It represents a promise unfulfilled, a glimpse into an alternate history where muscle cars might have continued to reign without compromise.